There's a specific kind of silence that only exists in the high mountains of Afghanistan. It's not a peaceful quiet. It's heavy. It's the kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. You learn to listen to that silence, to feel it in your teeth. If you ignore it, those mountains will swallow you whole. It was late August, and our team, a 6-man reconnaissance element, was tasked with what the brass called a standard overwatch. Our area of operations was a jagged, nameless ridgeline overlooking a narrow transit corridor deep in the Hindu Kush. Intel suggested a high-value logistics node was moving weapons through the valley floor. We were supposed to fly in under the cover of darkness, hack 5 clicks up the mountain, dig into a concealed observation post, OP, and paint targets for the birds to neutralize. In and out, 48 hours, the intelligence officer had said during the briefing, tapping a satellite map. The valley is a ghost town. No locals, no hostile presence on the high ground. You'll have the best seats in the house. But a map never tells the whole story. The insertion was a textbook blackout flight. We rode in the belly of an MH-47 Chinook, the cabin bathed in the eerie green glow of our night vision goggles. The smell of aviation fuel, sweat, and dry gun oil was thick in the air. As the bird flared over our LZ, a precarious, rocky shelf halfway up the mountain, the rear ramp dropped. The rotor wash was violent, blasting us with dust and sharp shale as we rushed out into the freezing night. Within seconds, the chopper banked hard and disappeared into the black sky, taking the roar of its engines with it. And then, that heavy, suffocating silence settled over us. We immediately formed a perimeter, kneeling in the dirt, rifles up, scanning the darkness. Nothing moved. Our point man, Miller, gave the hand signal to move out. The climb was brutal. We were carrying over 90 pounds of gear each, water, extra ammo, batteries, and the heavy comms equipment. Every step was a physical battle against the loose scree and the thinning mountain air. My lungs burned and the straps of my ruck cut deep into my shoulders, but nobody made a sound. We operated in absolute quiet, communicating only through subtle clicks on the radio and hand signals in the dark. By 0400 hours, we reached our designated OP. It was a natural rock formation that offered a command and view of the valley floor while supposedly shielding us from the north and west. We quietly set up our hides, laying out camouflage netting and positioning the spotting scopes. Hayes, our heavy weapons guy, settled his saw into a crevice that provided a perfect interlocking field of fire. Doc, our medic, tucked himself into a shallow depression behind us. I took the radio, checked our comms with the Tactical Operations Center, and got the double-click confirmation. We were green. Everything was going exactly according to plan. Then, the sun started to rise. The Hindu Kush is beautiful at dawn, but as the golden light crept down the sheer rock faces, the valley below us didn't look right. Intel had assured us it was a ghost town, untouched for months, but as I glassed the valley floor through my optics, I didn't see overgrown goat paths or abandoned structures. I saw freshly stacked sandbags. I saw camouflage netting strung up between the rocks, meticulously placed to match the local terrain. "Hey," Miller whispered, his voice tight. He was looking through the high-powered spotting scope, his eye pressed hard against the cup. "Look at the northern ridge. 2 o'clock. I shifted my binoculars. My stomach instantly dropped. The northern ridge was significantly higher than our position, and it was supposed to be completely impassable. But there, catching the faintest glint of the morning sun, was the unmistakable shape of a DSHK heavy machine gun barrel protruding from a fortified bunker. It wasn't pointed down at the valley floor. It was pointed directly at our hide. We hadn't set up an overwatch. We had walked right into the bottom of a bowl, and the enemy was sitting on the rim. Before I could even key the radio to call it in,
The heavy silence of the mountain was shattered by the sharp, terrifying crack of an incoming round, and the rock inches from Miller's face exploded into dust.
The crack of the sniper's rifle was still echoing across the valley when the world simply tore apart. Before Miller could even pull himself back from the spotting scope, the heavy machine gun on the northern ridge opened up. It wasn't the rapid, tearing canvas sound of an M4. It was the slow, rhythmic, chest-thumping boom, boom, boom of a 12.7mm DSK. Each round sounded like a sledgehammer striking the mountain. The sheer kinetic energy of those massive rounds impacting the stone around us was terrifying. "Contact! Contact front!" Hayes roared, his voice barely cutting through the sudden, deafening chaos. We didn't need the warning. Training, drilled into us through countless hours of sweat and misery back home, took over before conscious thought could process the sheer adrenaline of the moment. We instinctively pressed ourselves into the unforgiving granite, trying to become as small as humanly possible. The rocks forming our carefully selected observation post began to disintegrate. Showers of sharp, jagged shale rained down on our helmets and body armor. The air instantly thickened with a choking cloud of pulverized rock, dry earth, and the harsh metallic scent of cordite. "Doc! Miller! Sound off!" I yelled over the din, my face pressed firmly into the dirt. I'm good," Miller shouted back, scrambling backward into a narrow fissure, wiping a line of blood from his cheek where a piece of flying rock fragmentation had grazed him. It wasn't a severe injury, but it was a terrifyingly close call. Hayes was already moving. He dragged his heavy M249 saw up to the lip of our defensive perimeter, propping the bipod against a shattered boulder. He didn't have a clear target on the DSK. It was too elevated, too heavily fortified, but he needed to put something back downrange to buy us seconds. He squeezed the trigger, sending short, controlled bursts echoing up the valley. Brrr, brrr. Hot brass rained down onto the stone beside him. "We need suppressive fire on that bunker," our team leader, Sergeant Evans, barked, low-crawling through the dust toward my position. "Get on the radio. Call in an air asset. We need close air support right now." I grabbed the handset of the PRC-117 field radio. My hands were shaking, not from panic, but from the massive, uncontrollable dump of adrenaline coursing through my veins. It felt like my heart was trying to batter its way out of my rib cage. TOC, this is Viper Actual, emergency, troops in contact, over." Nothing, just the flat, empty hiss of static. I frantically checked the frequency, checked the battery, and tightened the connections. TOC, this is Viper Actual, taking heavy plunging fire from elevated positions, requesting immediate air support, over. More static. A sickening realization washed over me. I looked up at the short whip antenna extending from my ruck. It had been cleanly sheared off, snapped in half by a piece of shrapnel or a stray round during the opening volley. We were completely cut off. "Sergeant!" I yelled, pulling the useless handset away from my ear. "Comms are dead, antenna is dusted, and we're sitting in a dead zone anyway. We have no line of sight to a repeater." Evans's jaw tightened. The DSK paused for a brief, agonizing second, likely reloading, but the silence was immediately filled with the angry buzz of smaller caliber AK-47 fire raking our position. The incoming rounds snapped and popped viciously above our heads. "Okay, new plan," Evans yelled, assessing the crumbling rock wall that was the only thing keeping us alive. "We can't stay here. If they drop mortars into this bowl, we're done." He was right. We were pinned in a classic L-shaped ambush, and the enemy held all the tactical advantages. We had to move. But to where? Every direction looked like a death sentence. Suddenly, Doc, who had been scanning the lower ridgeline to our right, shouted, "Movement! 3 o'clock! They're pushing up the draw!" I forced myself to look over the edge of our crumbling cover. The morning sun was fully up now, baking the rocks and creating shimmering heat waves. Through the settling dust and the glare, I could see them. It wasn't just a skeleton crew manning a heavy gun on the peak. There were at least 24 fighters, moving with practiced tactical precision up the steep rocky draw to our eastern flank. They were using the natural defilade, bounding from rock to rock, laying down suppressive fire as they advanced.
They weren't just pinning us down for the fun of it. They were systematically maneuvering to overrun our position. They were closing the net, and we had absolutely nowhere to run.
"They're trying to roll up our right side," Evans shouted over the relentless, rhythmic thud of the D-Shik pounding our frontal cover. "Hayes, shift fire. Lock down that draw. The rest of you, pick your targets and conserve your ammo. Do not spray and pray." I scrambled on my elbows and knees, dragging my M4 through the pulverized dirt to a narrow gap between two shattered boulders. Peering down the eastern slope, the heat shimmer made the rocks look like they were breathing. The enemy fighters were moving fast, bounding in pairs. One would lay down a blistering barrage of AK-47 fire, while the other dashed forward 10 yards, diving behind the next jagged outcropping. They were well-trained, operating with a fluid, terrifying aggression that told us they had done this many times before. I rested the handguard of my rifle on a flat stone, took a slow, deep breath, and let half of it out, just like on the range. The red chevron of my ACOG optic danced over the chest of a fighter sprinting between boulders. I squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against my shoulder, delivering a sharp, familiar punch. The fighter dropped instantly, neutralized before he could reach his next piece of cover. But there was no time to process the hit. 3 more fighters immediately laid down concentrated suppressive fire directly on my muzzle flash. Bullets cracked past my helmet like angry hornets, snapping the air and sending vicious splinters of rock directly into my face. I ducked hard, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Beside me, Hayes opened up with his saw. The heavy, sustained roar of the M249 was the most beautiful sound in the world. He dumped a long, controlled burst down the draw, chewing up the shale and forcing the advancing fighters to flatten out behind the terrain. For a brief, desperate second, I thought we had stalled their momentum. Then came the unmistakable, terrifying whoosh of a rocket-propelled grenade. "RPG!" Miller screamed. I threw my arms over the back of my neck and pressed my face deep into the dirt. The explosion was deafening. It didn't hit our position directly, detonating instead against a massive granite slab just 10 feet to our right. The shock wave felt like a physical blow, a massive, invisible hand slamming into my back and driving all the breath from my lungs. A thick, choking cloud of black smoke, vaporized rock, and gray dust instantly enveloped our tight perimeter, entirely blocking out the morning sun. Through the intense ringing in my ears, I heard a sharp, guttural grunt. I looked over and saw Miller sprawled flat on his back, gasping wildly for air. "Doc!" I yelled, scrambling blindly toward him, ignoring the relentless stream of rounds snapping overhead. Doc was there in a flash, his hands flying over Miller's tactical rig, frantically searching for the source of the trauma. I'm hit! He wheezed, his face pale beneath the thick layers of grime and sweat. Doc quickly ripped open the Velcro of Miller's tactical vest. Buried deep in the center of the front ceramic trauma plate was a twisted, deformed chunk of steel shrapnel. The armor had done its job flawlessly, stopping the jagged metal from penetrating his chest cavity, but the sheer kinetic energy transfer was brutal. It had severely bruised his ribs and knocked the wind completely out of him. He wasn't critically injured, but he was down for the count, at least temporarily. We were now effectively fighting with 5 men. As the dust began to clear, the grim reality of our tactical situation settled over us like a suffocating blanket. The enemy had used the blinding smoke of the RPG blast as cover to aggressively close the distance. They were no longer 70 yards. They were within 30. They were trying to herd us, flushing us out from our rocky depression and pushing us upward directly into the open sights of the heavy machine gun waiting on the northern ridge. If we stayed put, we would be overrun by the flanking force. If we retreated up the exposed slope, we would be cut to pieces by the D-Shik. I hastily checked my magazines. 2 were already empty. The acrid smell of burnt powder was making my eyes water. Then, over the chaotic din of the firefight, a sound cut through the noise that made my blood run absolutely cold.
It was a sharp metallic clink, followed by the distinct sound of something heavy rolling across the loose shale, stopping just inches from my right boot.
Time slowed to an absolute crawl. The cylindrical, ribbed shape of an F1 fragmentation grenade rested perfectly against the faded leather of my right boot. The spoon was gone. I didn't think. I reacted. It was pure, primal instinct drilled into muscle memory over thousands of repetitions. "Grenade!" I screamed, a raw, guttural sound that tore at my throat. I violently kicked my leg out, sending the iron pineapple skittering back down the steep incline of loose shale, and simultaneously threw my entire body weight backward over Miller. The detonation was a deafening, chest-crushing crack. A wave of blistering heat and pulverized stone washed over us. Shrapnel shrieked through the air, sparking violently against the granite walls of our crumbling redoubt. The shockwave rattled my teeth and sent a high-pitched, agonizing whine ringing through my skull. For a terrifying second, the world went completely gray, choked by the thick, swirling dust of the blast. I pushed myself up on my elbows, coughing violently, tasting copper and dry earth. "Sound off," Sergeant Evans barked, his voice sounding hollow and distant through the ringing in my ears. "Good," Hayes yelled from his SAW position, though his face was a mask of gray powder. "Doc's good," came the reply. Miller, still gasping from the earlier impact to his vest, gave a weak but definitive thumbs up. We had survived the blast, but the grim reality of our situation was tightening around us like a vice. The enemy, realizing their grenade hadn't finished the job, intensified their fire. The relentless, rhythmic thud of the Dishka on the northern ridge resumed, systematically chewing the top off our rocky cover. Below us, the flanking force was creeping closer, their AK-47 fire snapping just inches above our helmets. They were using the terrain perfectly, closing the net. "Ammo check," Evans demanded, low crawling between our positions. "3 mags," I replied, my voice raspy. 2.5, Doc added, his eyes scanning the lower ridgeline. "I've got maybe 100 rounds left for the pig," Hayes grunted, patting the plastic drum of his M249. "After that, she's an expensive club." It was 0800 hours. The Afghan sun was fully crested now, baking the rocks and turning our body armor into a suffocating oven. Sweat stung my eyes and pooled under my helmet. My canteen felt mockingly light against my hip. We were running out of time, running out of bullets, and running out of luck. Evans pulled a laminated mat from his chest rig, wiping away a layer of dust to read the contour lines. "We can't stay in this bowl," he said, his tone dead serious. "They've got us fixed. If they bring up mortars, we're entirely neutralized. We have to break the ambush." He pointed a filthy, gloved finger at a narrow, jagged draw about 50 yards to our south. It was slightly elevated and heavily shadowed by a massive rock overhang. That draw connects to a goat trail that leads to the secondary extraction zone. If we can get there, it breaks the line of sight with the Dishka. "Sergeant, that's 50 yards of open shale," I said, my heart sinking. "We step out from this cover, that heavy gun will cut us in half." "Not if he can't see us," Evans countered, his eyes locked on mine. He reached into his pouch and pulled out 3 M118 smoke grenades. We pop smoke, blank out the ridge, and push the flanking force hard. We go directly through them. Violence of action. It was a desperate, terrifying plan, a true Hail Mary. But looking at the disintegrating rock around us and the dwindling ammo in my pouches, it was the only option we had left. "Hayes," Evans ordered, "you're going to dump everything you have left at that Dishka bunker. Keep their heads down. On my mark, we pop smoke, we grab Miller, and we run like hell." We all nodded. The fear was there, a cold, heavy knot in my stomach, but the bond of the squad overpowered it. We were going home together, or not at all. I gripped the spoon of my smoke grenade, my knuckles white. I looked over at Hayes, who locked the bolt of his SAW to the rear, a grim smile cracking through the dirt on his face. "Get ready," Evans whispered, his thumb resting on the pin. The heavy machine gun paused its firing. A brief, terrible silence fell over the mountain. "Execute!" Evans roared.
Execute! The pins flew from the M18s. We hurled the metal canisters as far up the slope as our exhausted arms could manage.
With a sharp hiss, thick columns of red and green smoke began to violently billow outward. The mountain draft caught the chemical clouds, smearing them into a dense, opaque curtain that perfectly blanketed the line of sight between our exposed bowl and the DSK waiting on the northern ridge. Hayes didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. He rose to one knee, the stock of the M249 pressed ruthlessly into his shoulder, and unleashed the absolute last of his linked ammunition. The deafening, sustained roar of the saw was a physical pressure in the thin mountain air. He walked a solid stream of tracers directly into the narrow firing port of the fortified bunker. Sparks, pulverized concrete and dust exploded around the heavy gun's position. He couldn't destroy it, but he was keeping their heads down. He was buying us the only currency that mattered right now: seconds. "Go, go, go!" Sergeant Evans bellowed, his voice tearing through the chaos. Doc and I grabbed Miller by the reinforced drag handle on the back of his plate carrier. He was moving on his own, his boots desperately finding purchase on the sliding shale, but he was severely slowed, still fighting for every agonizing breath after the shrapnel impact. We broke from the false safety of our crumbling rock wall and plunged headfirst into the open. The 50 yards to the southern draw felt like 50 miles. It was a dead sprint across a 45-degree incline of loose, shifting rock. My lungs burned like I was breathing in ground glass. The 90 pounds of gear strapped to my body, usually a comforting embrace of survival tools, now felt like a lead anchor actively trying to drag me down into the dirt. Sweat blinded me, stinging my eyes, but I kept my legs pumping. We hit the edge of the colored screen smoke just as the flanking force realized our desperate gambit. The rhythmic popping of their AK-47s shifted from our abandoned OP and began blindly snapping through the fog. The distinctive, terrifying crack, crack, crack of supersonic lead passing mere inches from my helmet was constant. We couldn't stop. We couldn't even slow down. We had to push directly through their formation with overwhelming violence of action. "Contact right!" Doc roared over the gunfire. Through the swirling, unnatural red haze, 3 enemy fighters materialized like ghosts, scrambling rapidly up the jagged rocks to cut off our escape route. They were dangerously close, less than 15 meters away. There was absolutely no time to align my eye with my ACOG optic. I brought my M4 up, trusting the thousands of hours of close-quarters point-shooting drills, and squeezed the trigger twice. The lead fighter was neutralized instantly, dropping his weapon and tumbling backward down the steep incline into the dirt. Hayes, moving with terrifying precision on my left, took out the second fighter with a tight, controlled 3-round burst. The third combatant, realizing he was severely outmatched, dove hard behind a massive boulder, blindly spraying his rifle over his head in our general direction. "Keep moving! Do not get bogged down!" Evans screamed, smoothly dumping his empty magazine and slapping a fresh one home without breaking his stride. We were halfway there, 25 yards left. My legs were vibrating with fatigue, the muscles screaming for oxygen. Miller was stumbling, his face a tight mask of pure, unadulterated agony, but his sheer willpower kept him upright. Then the nightmare scenario happened. The DSK roared back to life. The heavy gunner on the ridge, realizing he had lost visual contact, began systematically and blindly sweeping the mountainside through the smoke. The massive 12.7mm rounds chewed through the rock face above us, raining down a terrifying, blinding shower of razor-sharp stone splinters. The ground literally shook beneath our boots with every impact. We hit the mouth of the southern draw, diving frantically into the heavy, life-saving shadows of the rock overhang. It was cooler here, the granite solid and unbroken. Doc violently dragged Miller over the threshold, pulling him deep into the defilade. I spun around, raising my rifle to cover our 6 o'clock. My heart instantly dropped into my stomach. I stared back through the dissipating red smoke, squinting against the harsh sun. Hayes wasn't with us. I stared back through the dissipating red smoke, squinting against the harsh sun. Hayes was pinned behind a meager knee-high slab of shale 30 yards out in the open. His saw was entirely empty, resting uselessly on the rock, and he was desperately transitioning to his M9 sidearm as a fresh squad of enemy fighters swarmed directly over our old position, cutting him completely off.
The image of Hayes stranded 30 yards out in the open is permanently burned into my memory. He was entirely cut off. The enemy flanking force was swarming our old observation post like angry ants, and the D-Shock was blindly chewing up the mountainside just above his head. He had his M9 drawn, a tiny sliver of black steel against an impossible wave of hostility. "Covering fire! Everything you have left!" Evans roared, not hesitating. We weren't leaving him. We would die on this mountain before leaving one of our own. I slammed my final 30-round magazine into the magwell of my M4, sending the bolt forward with a metallic clack. Beside me, Doc abandoned his medical bag and brought up his rifle. Evans was already firing, his stance wide and aggressive at the mouth of the draw. The three of us unleashed a wall of lead, pouring sustained volume into the rocks around our old position. The sheer noise and the confined space of the draw was deafening, a physical pressure that battered my eardrums. "Hayes, move! Move!" I screamed, my voice tearing. Through the dissipating red smoke, I saw Hayes vault over his meager cover. He launched himself into a chaotic, desperate sprint across the sliding shale. The enemy fighters immediately shifted their attention, their rifles snapping viciously in his direction. Geysers of gray dust erupted around his boots. The D-Shock gunner, drawn by the sudden movement, swung the heavy barrel down. 10 yards. My rifle clicked empty. The bolt locked back. I dropped it to its sling and drew my own sidearm, my hands slick with sweat and grime. 5 yards. A burst of intermediate caliber rounds shattered a boulder right next to Hayes, sending a shower of sharp stone fragments across his helmet. He stumbled, his knee hitting the dirt hard, but momentum and pure adrenaline carried him forward. Evans reached out, grabbing the thick webbing of Hayes' tactical vest, and violently hauled him over the threshold into the dark, protective shadow of the draw. We all collapsed into a tangled heap of exhausted limbs, ceramic plates, and heavy breathing. We were combat ineffective, empty, dehydrated, and physically broken. The enemy fire outside the draw intensified, inching closer. They knew we were trapped. It was only a matter of minutes before they pushed into the bottleneck and finished the job. I closed my eyes, leaning my head against the cool, ancient granite. The heavy silence of the mountain was gone, replaced by the chaotic symphony of our impending end. But then, a new sound bled into the chaos. It started as a low, mechanical thrum deep in the valley, a vibration I felt in my chest before my ears could register it. The thrum built into a roar, entirely drowning out the gunfire. "Fast movers!" Doc yelled, his voice cracking with a mix of disbelief and pure relief. 2 fast movers, E-15E Strike Eagles, tore across the narrow sliver of sky above the valley, flying dangerously low. We hadn't reached the Tactical Operations Center, but another unit operating miles away had picked up our fragmented emergency bursts on a relay. The jets banked hard, their afterburners glowing like twin suns. Seconds later, the mountain shook with earth-shattering violence. The bunker, the heavy gun, and the hostile fighters manning it were instantly eliminated in a massive, blinding plume of black smoke and pulverized rock. The flanking force, suddenly stripped of their overwatch and realizing the sky was now heavily armed, broke contact immediately, melting back into the treacherous cave networks of the Hindu Kush. The hike to the secondary extraction point took 4 grueling hours. Every step was a battle against total physical failure. Miller leaned heavily on Doc, while Evans, Hayes, and I formed a tight, exhausted perimeter. When the MH-47 finally flared over the ridge to pull us out, the rotor wash felt like an embrace. Sitting in the dimly lit belly of the Chinook, the deafening roar of the engines isolating us in our own thoughts, the adrenaline finally began to recede. It left behind a cold, hollow ache. I looked at the men around me. We were battered, bruised, coated in a thick paste of sweat and mountain dust, and entirely silent. There were no cheers, no high fives. We had survived, but the mountain had taken its toll. I closed my eyes,
listening to the steady, powerful rhythm of the routers. We were flying away, but a part of me knew I would never truly leave that ridge. The heavy, suffocating silence of the Afghan mountains would echo in my mind forever.